we can't talk about courage without talking about fear. We need to talk about fear first. So I want you to think about a time when you did something courageous in your life. The very first memory that I have of doing anything courageous, this is the image that was in front of me. It was the summer of 1961. I was at my older brother Phil's baseball game. He had finished the second grade and was heading into the third grade. I had finished kindergarten and was headed into the first grade in the coming fall. I'm at his baseball game. His team is taking the field for the last half of the last inning. If they get the team out, they win the game. So my brother's team takes the field. Very quickly, they get the first 2 outs, and the next guy is coming up to bat. This guy in Wahoo, Nebraska, which is where we lived at the time, this guy's name was Billy, and Billy was a bully. You did not mess with Billy, especially if you were younger than Billy. You certainly didn't do that. I'm standing behind the backstop with Dennis and Doug, my 2 best friends, Dennis, Doug, and Dave, the 3 Ds, and we're standing behind, and Dennis and Doug, as Billy is coming up to the plate, said, "Dave, we dare you to yell at Billy." And I said, "No way," because again, you didn't mess with Billy. And they said, "Come on, Dave, we dare you, we dare you, we dare you." And then they did what we actually did back in the day. They said, "Dave, we double dog dare you to yell at Billy." Well, those of you who are in my age bracket, you can't turn down the double dog dare. So as the pitcher began to go into his windup and he fired that first pitch, I hollered, "Swing, batter, swing." Billy swung and missed, strike one. Dennis and Doug and I jump up and down. We punch each other in the arms because the high five hadn't even been invented yet. We turn to look back to the field and get this view again, but Billy is staring right at me. Dennis and Doug got really excited by that. "Oh, Dave, come on, you got to do it again. You got to do it again." Pitcher goes into his windup. He fires pitch number 2. Swing, batter, swing. Billy swings and misses, strike 2. We jump up and down, punch each other in the arms some more. We turn and look back. Billy again is staring right at me. Dennis and Doug are beside themselves with excitement now. "Come on, Dave, just one more time, one more time." Pitcher goes into his windup. He fires that pitch. Swing, batter, swing. Billy swings and misses, strike 3. My brother's team wins the game. Dennis and Doug and I jump up and down, punch each other some more, and we turn to walk away, and boom. Standing directly in front of me is Billy. Billy had dropped his bat, came around the backstop, and now I'm standing eye to chin looking up at Billy. He apparently felt as though I had something to do with the outcome of that at bat. And as I stood there, I noticed him begin to clench his fist, and he reared back, and pow, he hit me right in the stomach. He actually hit me a little lower. He hit me right in the bladder, and he literally made me wet my pants. I can still remember to this day that whole incident. And as I walked home that night, I can still remember the warm feeling that I had, not because I'd wet my pants, but because I'd had the courage to do something that Dennis and Doug didn't have the courage to do. There is a price to doing things courageously. I paid a price for yelling at Billy. But I believe there's an even greater price if we choose to live in fear. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is fear and courage and how those two things impact our lives. Nearly all of us experience fear in our lives, but we don't talk about it much. We don't call up our friends and say, "Hey, let's go get a cup of coffee," or "Let's go grab a beer, and while we're there, let's talk about our fears." We kind of hold that stuff close to the vest. We might share it occasionally with somebody, but we want everybody, even family members, even spouses, we often hold those things close to the vest, and we don't share them because we want people to think that we've got everything under control. And yet, fear oftentimes so controls our life that we can't get out of our own way. And we become a hostage to those things that hold us in our fear. Courage, on the other hand, is a word that we often reserve for firefighters and police officers and soldiers. Courage is something that other people do. It's big events, big things that people do in order to show how courageous they are, or sometimes courage chooses us rather than us choosing courage. But courage is a word that we reserve for big events and other people. And yet I truly believe that we all have opportunities to be courageous each and every single day. The foundation of this talk comes from Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for I, the Lord your God, will be with you wherever you go. What I envision in my mind every time I read this verse, and if you know the story here, you know that Moses, who has been leading the people to the promised land, Moses has died, and the 1 month period of mourning is up. And Joshua is taking over, and God is giving Joshua the instructions now in Joshua 1. And I envision God and Joshua. God has his arm around Joshua, and they're looking down into the promised land. And God is telling him, have I not commanded you? Because he has said this before. Earlier, he has said this. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for I, the Lord your God, will be with you wherever you go. God knew what was in front of Joshua. Joshua had no idea, but God knew that it was going to be tough, that it was going to require courage. So this is what he's telling him. And so Joshua now is kind of starting to, pull himself up and say, all right, this is going to be tough. I don't know what's coming, but I've got to be ready. None of us know what is coming. As we head into when we're done with this today, none of us know what's coming. But here's what we do know, that the God that was with Joshua, that had his arm around Joshua, and the God that told him, be strong and courageous, that very same God has his arm around us. And he is saying to us, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for I, the Lord your God, will be with you wherever you go. That's the foundation of what we're going to talk about today. Two kinds of fear that we face in our life. Rational fear. If the building, your home, if that's where you likely are, if some of you may be in your offices, but if that building were to catch on fire, it would be rational for you to probably have some fear and get out and save what you can, find other people, help them get out, but it's rational to get out. The other kind of fear is irrational fear. And this is the kind of fear that holds us hostage. And it looks kind of like this. These are the thoughts that we have. We don't think that we're good enough. We don't think that we're worthy. We're worried about what others might say. We ask ourselves all the time, what if? What if this? What if that? And so we stay stuck in our fear. And how does it show up in our lives? Avoidance, procrastination, perfection, blame, settling, compromising, rationalizing. There's other ways as well. These are the ones, particularly those first three, that show up most often in my life. And then we lay in bed at night and we say, why didn't I? Because we recognize how irrational that fear is. And we lay in bed and we say, why didn't I call that guy that had a potential job for me? Or why didn't I call that client or customer of mine that's upset? Why did I say, oh, I'll wait till tomorrow? Because there's some fear around it. We don't want to hear what they have to say. We're a little bit afraid. We're afraid we might lose them as a client. Why didn't I have that difficult conversation with my spouse or that difficult conversation with my kids? And so we put it off, and then we vow at night to say, tomorrow's going to be different. First thing in the morning, I'm going to tackle it. I'm going to make that call. I'm going to have that conversation. I'm going to do whatever it is that I need to do. And then we wake up the next morning and we find some reason to avoid, some reason to procrastinate, some reason to put it off. It's tomorrow's going to be Wednesday, and I think they have conference calls every Wednesday morning, so I'll wait a little bit. So we put it off, and we put it off, and we put it off. And we lay in bed again the same way the very next night. I'll give you a moment to ponder these two photos. That image on the left, as I look at that image on the left, I ask myself this question. How far out in the road would that branch have had to be in order for that driver of the paint truck to do something about it? Obviously, that wasn't far enough out. So they simply drove around and avoided it. The question on the right is, how big of an animal would it have to be? Obviously, a raccoon wasn't big enough. Would it have to be a dog? Would it have to be a deer? Would it have to be a bear? And obviously the raccoon wasn't big enough, and so they simply drove over it. And oftentimes this is what we do with our fears. We drive around them, we drive over them, we sweep them under the rug. We simply pretend that they're not there in the hopes that they'll go away. And as we wait, the fear often grows and grows and grows until it looks something like this. And where we want to be is where that red truck is on the back side. This is an actual photo from the mountains in Colorado. And in order to get to where that red truck is by using the road, it's a 223-mile detour just because of the mountains. I took a lot of detours in my life, and this is an image that I had for much of my life that I'll tell you about as we get into it a little bit more here. And I took a lot of detours, and detours are great things. In those detours, I worked for some great companies. I worked for some great people. I got to travel a lot, and I did some wonderful things. Detours sometimes lead us simply to really great restaurants or great ice cream shops. And detours are good, but when we're being controlled by fear, we eventually come back to the boulder and we push and we push and we push, trying to get it out of the way. And so those are some of the things that we'll talk about today. Never underestimate the value of a crisis, Romans 5:3-4, but we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. For some of you, what's been going on with the corona situation and also with the unrest, the civil unrest that's going on, some of you may be experiencing crisis in that. I want to tell you a crisis that started for me about 10 and a half years ago. In January of 2010, I lost my job. My wife and I were living in the Twin Cities at the time, and I didn't realize how bad the economy was from 2008 till 2012 and 13 because I was working, so I didn't know how bad the economy was. I quickly found out. I was attending a number of job networking groups in the Twin Cities area, and I found out very quickly that people who were far more capable than I was were not finding work, and they'd already been out of work for long periods of time. My unemployment began to stretch into month after month after month after month. Fast forward to February of 2011, and now my wife loses her job. She'd been working in a church in the Twin Cities for about 15 years. Giving in the church was way down, and someone had to be let go, and she was the first. So now I've been unemployed for 13 months. We are going through very quickly, and it's almost gone, all of our savings. I have been seeing a wonderful Christian counselor, been diagnosed with situational depression because I'm not finding work. I'm not fulfilling my role as a godly man. And it was a crisis time in our lives. Fast forward to June, our house has been on sale for many months. The market continues to fall and fall and fall. And our home, which at one time had well over $100,000 in equity and helped us put our 2 kids through school, now when we sell it in June, we come out of it with $7,000. Now, we were very blessed and fortunate in that we didn't get foreclosed on or had to do a short sale. We were very fortunate in that. But in June of 2011, my wife and I, our marriage is the worst it's ever been. We have no jobs, we have no home, and we have $7,000 to our name. But I can tell you that in this crisis time, in this suffering, it produced perseverance, it produced character, and it produced hope. Because if I hadn't gone through that, I wouldn't have been meeting with this wonderful counselor who helped me to recognize and understand the role that fear had played in my life. I can tell you today, it's one of the best things that ever happened to me because it helped me to develop hope out of suffering. And so we'll tell you a little bit more about that. And I think there's three steps that I took to developing courage in my life. The first one was to name your fear. Think of the story of Moses in Exodus 3 and 4, where God came to him and asked him to lead the people to the promised land. And his response, as we all know, was, "No way, Lord, I'm not that guy. I don't communicate well. I'm just, see, Moses knew of his past. And oftentimes fear is a result of our past experience. So Moses is saying, I'm not the guy, but yet God calls on us and he uses our past experience to help us make a difference in the lives of others. And in making a difference in the lives of others, we make a difference in the lives of the kingdom. So step number 1 is to name your fear. I say it's like being an alcoholic or a drug addict. If you're not willing to acknowledge your fear, if you're simply going to drive around it or drive over it, you're not going to deal with it. And it will always be there. And it will always be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it will always be negatively impacting your life. Dr. Phil says you cannot change what you don't acknowledge. Now, what is the boulder that you are facing? I'm not going to ask you to share your boulder today, but I want to encourage you to share that with someone. And we'll talk about that more here in just a second. But I do want to tell you about the boulder that I had in my life. For the last 9 years, I have been running my business as a speaker and a coach and a trainer. This is something that I've wanted to do since I was 28 years old. But this is something that I thought other people did. I didn't think that I was good enough to do this. So I think back to a time in my life, November 7th of 1969. I was sitting in Mr. Wilson's math class in Buffalo, Minnesota. It was 9:30 in the morning and there's a knock on the door. Mr. Wilson, who was the stereotypical math teacher, he had the round horn-rimmed glasses, he had slicked back hair, and he had patches, elbow patches on all of his sport coats. Mr. Wilson went and answered the door. As he visited with who was ever behind there, he glanced back at me, glanced back at the person he was visiting with, and he said, okay, I'll send him down. He looked back at me and he said, David, they need to see you in the office. Why don't you pack up your things? They need to see you in the office. So I picked up my books and I started to walk down the aisle to get out of the classroom. And as I'm doing so, my best friends are saying, hey, what'd you do now, Dave? What'd you do now? And I was a pretty good kid. I didn't get in much trouble. So I was as confused as everybody as to why I was being called out of the classroom. I went into the office and the administrative assistant said, go down that hall and go in the second door on the right. So I went down the hall and I went in the second door on the right. And here's my older brother, Phil, now a junior in high school, and the Catholic priest from town. He said, Dave, your dad passed away this morning. At 7:30 when I went to school, Dad was alive. At 9:30, Dad has passed away and is dead. We walked across the street to the elementary school where my third grade brother was and picked him up, and we came out. And as we came out, the Catholic priest got us into a little semicircle, and he said, now, boys, this is going to be really hard on your mom. So I don't want you to cry. I don't want you to ask any questions. I just want you to be men. I don't blame the Catholic priest for that. A lot of times people, if I'm speaking to a crowd, there will be gasps or people will roll their eyes or shake their heads like, wow, I can't believe that's what you did or that's what he said. But in 1969, that's kind of the way it was. So I didn't cry. I didn't ask any questions. And I did what I thought it was to be a man. But the reality was what was most important to me at that time in life was what sport is in season. I didn't pay a lot of attention to what it meant to be a man. Fast forward 3 weeks later, and it's the start of basketball season for the 9th grade team. Now, I'm 6'7" now. I wasn't at that time, but basketball has been a very, very big part of my life. So we had our first practice on a Monday. After practice was over, I walked home. We lived in a parsonage directly across the street. My dad was a pastor of a Lutheran church in town. So the church was directly across the street from the high school, and the parsonage was right next door. So I had literally a 30-second walk to elementary school and junior and senior high school. I came home after practice. It's 5:30. My mom hears me come in the back, calls my 2 brothers to come to the table. As we sit down to eat, my mom goes over to the kitchen counter, picks up the food, brings it over, starts to set it on the table. And as she does, she pauses, and she stands up and she starts to cry. She says, I can't believe I set 5 places instead of 4. She'd set a place for my dad. He's been gone for 3 weeks, and she set a place for Dad. She ran back to her room crying. Eventually, my brother went back and talked to her, and then he came back, and the 3 of us ate our supper in silence. The next night when practice was over, I didn't want to go home to that. So I stayed after, and I shot baskets a little while longer, took my time in the shower. I got home about 6:15. My supper was neatly folded up in aluminum foil in the refrigerator. I took it out. I warmed up the stove. I warmed up my supper, and I went in and I sat in the TV room as my brothers watched, and that's where I had my supper. We lived in that parsonage for 7 more months, and I never had supper in that house again. It wasn't until I lost my job and went through the counseling with my counselor that she helped me to recognize that started a pattern of avoidance in my life. And that avoidance happened in jobs, it happened in school, it happened in relationships, it happened over and over and over again, where things that I didn't want to deal with, things that I was afraid to deal with, I simply didn't. I drove around them or I drove over them, and those fears became bigger and bigger and bigger because I didn't deal with them. Now, as I said just a few moments ago, what I wanted to do was be a speaker. That's what I wanted to do. But I had a great fear about that because this is something that really special people do. People like me don't do this. One of the things that I learned from my counselor was beginning to recognize my self-talk. What is the fear that you have right now, and what is your self-talk around that fear? What is the tape that plays in your mind when you're facing this fear? Here's some of the things that I would say to myself when I thought about becoming a speaker, and I would stand at that boulder and push and push and push. Who am I that anyone would want to hear what I have to say? I'm just a guy. There's nothing special about me, so why should I become a speaker? Because no one wants to hear what I have to say. There's nothing special about being able to stand up in front of a group of people and speak. For me, I get great joy and energy out of doing this. It doesn't mean that I don't get nervous. I do every single time. But because it comes easy for me, I therefore assign that it's easy for everyone else. So there's nothing special about this. Now, I recognize that for some of you listening, you're like, oh, there's no way I could ever do this. But recognize that I don't apply that logic to it. That's just the way that I think about it. There's nothing special about being able to do this. Anybody could. I don't have any letters behind my name, so I don't have any credibility. People who do this always have letters behind their name. Some of you listening today, I'm sure, listening and watching, have letters behind your name. I therefore assign that you are much smarter than I am, so why would you want to hear anything from me? Some of you are saying, well, that first slide that you put up there says Dave Cornell, BBG. You've got letters behind your name. Well, I do, but those letters simply mean Dave Cornell, big bald guy. As I said, I'm 6'7". I have no hair. I didn't have any letters, so I came up with some to put behind there on my own. I don't have a dramatic story. The people, again, who do this, they have survived an airline hijacking. They've survived cancer. They were orphaned at the age of 3 and raised in the wilderness by wolves. You know, they have stories that are amazing. I don't have an amazing story, so why would anybody want to listen to me? So here's some action steps for you around step number 1 of naming your fear. Write your fear down. What is it that you are afraid of? Are you afraid of failure? Are you afraid of success? Are you afraid that you're going to let somebody down? Write it down. They say that you are far more likely to achieve your goals if you write them down and share them with someone. There are statistics that prove that. I believe the very same thing is true when we write our fears down. Once we get them out of us, whether it's on paper or we verbalize it to someone, it takes some of the power away. It's out of us. It's no longer just inside of us churning. So write it down. Begin to get it out. Write your self-talk down. Our self-talk is a default. And when we have this default that has been part of our lives since we were kids, often, for me, that's the way it was. When that's our self-talk, it's going to play over and over, and it's a default. And we know in our computer world, the default is where everything goes back to because it's comfortable there. And that's where we go. Even though we have fear, we're comfortable in that fear because it doesn't make us uncomfortable by making us step out of our comfort zone. So write it down, become so familiar with it that when it starts to play in your head, you can begin to change that message. Find a mentor and a cheerleader. We need to have these people in our lives, and we need to be these for others. The mentor is the person that has their hand in the small of our back, and they're pushing us as we're leaning back against them saying, no, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. But they're pushing us to become better than we think that we can become. And the cheerleader is the person that's going to put their arm around us regardless. We may do something really dumb, but they're going to come up and say, hey, at least you did something. Way to go. You know, try something different. Maybe it'll be better next time. So those are your courage action steps around naming your fear. The second step is to frame your fear. Begin to see your fear differently. John 9:39 says, I have come to give sight to the blind and to show those who think they see that they are blind. So many stories in the Bible that we see, and we'll see one here in just a couple of moments, where the Pharisees thought they saw things one way. Well, they did see things one way, but Jesus helped them to see a different way. Jesus helps us to see our sin. Jesus helps us to see that there is saving grace in knowing him when we maybe never thought that that was a way to go. So we're going to begin to see our fear in a different way. Now, this is a picture of me, and these glasses that I'm wearing are the very first pair of glasses that I got when I was in the second grade. Miss Vibro, my second grade teacher at West Ward Elementary School in Wahoo, Nebraska, called my mom one day and said, I think Dave is having trouble seeing. He's squinting from his seat. You may want to take him to the eye doctor. So my mom, being the good mom that she was, took me to the eye doctor, and sure enough, I needed to get glasses. 10 days, 2 weeks later, whatever it was back in those days, however long it took to get glasses, we went and picked them up after school. I wore them home, wore them that night, put them on the nightstand when I went to bed, took them off the nightstand, put them on when I came down and had breakfast, and then I went out the back door to go to school. We lived on an alleyway, so I walked out to the alley, and I walked the half block down to where I would take a right-hand turn on the street to go the 1 block to school that I had. And as soon as I would take that right-hand turn onto the sidewalk, there was a big hedge, and Mom could no longer see me. Not that she watched me every day, but she could no longer see me, and I could no longer see the back door, so I knew she couldn't see me. But that first day, I took my glasses off and I put them in my pocket because I was afraid of what my friends were going to say about me now being a guy wearing glasses. I knew what they'd said to others. I knew what I'd said to others, and so I didn't want to hear it from them. At the end of the day, as I walked home, just before I got to the alleyway where I could see Mom, I took the glasses out of my pocket, put them on, and I walked home. Mom and Dad will never find out. I thought that I had them fooled, but I had a really good teacher, Miss Vibro. She called my mom and said, Dave, you might want to take him in, and she did. And she called my mom and said, well, I thought you took Dave to get glasses. My mom said, well, we did, and he has them. And Miss Vibro said, well, he's not wearing them. To this day, I can still remember sitting down with my mom and dad that night and having a conversation. I don't remember exactly what was said, but whatever it was that I said must have been something that led me to a career in sales, because I somehow convinced my parents as a second grader that I didn't need to wear those glasses. So that's how life went. Fast forward now to when I'm 23 years old, and I'm doing my very first play-by-play of a high school football game in Montrose, Colorado, where I'm now living and working for a radio station. and I'm calling the football game. I'm sitting in the broadcaster's booth up at the 50-yard line, up in the bleachers. The team I'm calling the game for takes the opening kickoff, and they run it out to about the 50-yard line. And then they begin to march down the field to the 40 and the 35 and the 30 and the 25. And the further and further they get away from me, the more I realize I can't see those great big numbers on the backs of those jerseys. And it's my job to tell the people at home who are listening on the radio what's going on in the game. I needed to see differently. We need to see different physically. We need to see different emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And that was a lesson that I learned right there. And here's a lesson I learned just in the last 10 years about how we begin to see differently. So the way that we see things, our beliefs about situations, other people, or ourselves affects how we feel. So we start in the upper left-hand corner, we go to the upper right, lower left, and then back up to the upper left. How we feel affects what we do, our behaviors or our actions. What we do affects what we get, our results. And what we get tends to reinforce how we see or how we believe. So again, how do we see something? And can we begin to see it in a whole different way? Let's use the story of the adulterous woman as an example. John 8, 1-8. She has been caught in adultery. The Pharisees bring her to Jesus, all of them with a stone or multiple stones in their hands. And they tell Jesus, we caught this woman in the very act of adultery. The law says that she needs to die. That was how they saw her. How did Jesus see her? Jesus saw her as a child of God. How did he feel about her? He loved her. What did he do? He told the Pharisees that they needed to stop, so he saved her physically at that point. But what did he get? He got a redeemed person. Now, here's the thing. The Pharisees get a bad rap in this story because they brought her to him. But what did Jesus tell the Pharisees? Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. So they must have begun to see her differently as well. Jesus must have convinced them to see her in a different way. This is a formula that we can use in our lives in many ways, but it's certainly a formula that we can use with our fears. So here's an example. Any of you ever have this as you played out your life when you were in school? My teacher hates me. Did any of you experience that? That was a C that I had. And we'll say hypothetically, it was 8th grade math, Miss Beckman, was a hypothetical situation. I was convinced that my teacher hated me. Now, it's important to understand that I was in the half of the class that made the upper half possible. So this was not an uncommon occurrence for me to see that my teacher hated me. So that's my C. So how do I feel about 8th grade math, Miss Beckman? I hate it. She hates me. So what do I do? What are some of the things that I'm likely to do? I'm going to act up in class. I'm not going to show up for class. I'm not going to turn in my homework. I'm going to do everything I can to be disruptive. So what do I get? I get an F. See, I told you my teacher hates me because I don't have any responsibility in this. It's all the teacher's fault. Because if my teacher didn't hate me, then I wouldn't be doing all of those things. So now let's change the C just a little bit. And now my C is that, okay, I have some responsibility in this. So that's my feel now. I feel I have some responsibility. So what do I begin to do? Well, maybe I show up for class every day. Maybe instead of sitting in the back of the room, maybe I move up a row. Maybe I turn in my homework a day late rather than not at all. Maybe I stay after and I ask a question. So what do I get? Hallelujah, I got a D. I went from an F to a D. You know, sometimes courage is incremental, not exponential. But I went from an F to a D because I began to see it differently. So now let's take a look at some things in our lives as Christian business people. How do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as a business person who happens to be a Christian? Or do you see yourself who is a Christian who happens to be a business person? That's one you may have heard before. This has been a common thought for some years now. And we are living in a society that is more and more and more challenging those of us who are people of the Christian faith. And are we willing to be bold? Are we willing to be courageous and run our businesses as Christian people and make a stand for who Jesus Christ is? So how do you see yourself? Are you a business person first who happens to be a Christian, or are you a Christian first who happens to be a business person? How do you see difficult conversations? This is, in the 9 years that I've been doing this, this is one of the topics that come up most often. I work with managers who are afraid to hold their employees accountable. I work with owners who are afraid to make difficult decisions because they're afraid of how people are going to react. I work with husbands and wives who are afraid to have difficult conversations with their spouses or with their kids. These difficult conversations are really, really hard. So we put them off because we see them as things that can begin to damage things even further, when the reality is, until we face that fear and get the card on the table and have the difficult conversation, we're never going to change anything. So we need to begin to feel that the conversation is the first step to changing things and making things better. So how do you see difficult conversations? Are they things to avoid and put off, or are they things to courageously face head on? How do you see other people? Do you have people in your life that just irritate and irk you because of the way that they see things, and they see things in a whole different way? Well, maybe from the perspective that they're looking, maybe they see things and see you in the same way that you see them. And so the see around, how do we begin to see other people that annoy us? Maybe our see then becomes to feel curious. Tell me more about why you see things that way. How did you develop those, the way that you feel about those things? Wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. And so we can begin to see other people, rather than seeing them as wrong, we begin to see them in a form of curiosity. How do you see sharing your faith? Wow, this is one that's a real challenge for me. It's a scary thing for me to share my faith. I'm always afraid that I'm going to offend somebody. But do we see it as a fear of offending someone, or do we see it as an opportunity to bring somebody to the kingdom? Wow, that's a dramatic way to look at it differently. Because so often I go right to sharing your faith. This is going to be scary. What are they going to think? Here's one of the realities too. It's not so much about having a formula to share my faith. It's about just telling my story of what God has done in my life. And that takes a lot of pressure off of me. And we often see sharing our faith as our responsibility. But we have to recognize it again to see it's not our responsibility to save anybody. That's God's responsibility. All we need to do is share our story. So how do you see sharing your faith? How do you see asking for help? I was told by that Catholic priest, don't ask any questions. And for people, asking for help is a difficult thing. You know, living in the United States, we're taught to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and you can do this on your own. And I truly believe, and I've learned this in the last 10 years, that asking for help is one of the most courageous things that we can do. To continue to stay in our need for help is living in fear. At the very beginning of the call, I was sharing, and most of you didn't hear this. I have a daughter, 36 years old, who was diagnosed about 5 weeks ago with breast cancer. She had her first chemo treatment last Thursday. And I just think of, what if she didn't share this with anybody? What if she just hung on to that and didn't ask for help. She's got 4 little ones, 9, 7, 5, and 2. She needs help. Her husband needs help. Think of the opportunities that people have had to reach out and help her, literally from all over the world. People from Thrive groups that I've already spoken to and shared the story, who are praying for her because I have been willing to share her story and ask for help. It's one of the most courageous things that we can do, and God wants us to share our stories so that people can use their gifts and their talents to help in situations like this. Do you have the courage to ask for help? Or are you going to live in the fear that asking for help is a sign of weakness? Where does our C come from? Our C comes from beliefs that we have about ourselves, and these beliefs come from messages that we get over the course of our lives. Messages that we get from our parents, from our siblings, from teachers, from coaches, from band directors, from TV shows that we watch, from movies that we see, from magazines that we read. Messages often that tell us that we are not enough. Let me give you an example. From my own life, I had a lot of success as an athlete growing up. My mom would often tell me, David, just because you can do these things on an athletic field doesn't make you better than anybody else. That was a well-intentioned message from my mom. However, how I internalized and received that message was, David, there's nothing special about anything that you do. So that developed a belief and a C for David that there's nothing special about David. Go back to those phrases that I used about my self-talk, and there is a direct correlation between that self-talk and my inability to become a speaker until I was in my mid to late 50s. Oftentimes, there are great messages that we receive, and we can thrive and hang on to those great messages. I've got great message in my life, but for some reason, that was one that I hung on to. We're a small group today, but I know that likely somebody in this group has received a message that has been incredibly hurtful, that you have hung on to, and it continues to hold you hostage. I wasn't able to change that message for me, to change the belief and change the C, until I went through that counseling. It's not until we change that message that we'll change the belief and change the C. Those messages hold us hostage, and we have to be willing to change them in order that we can grow and become who it is that God created us to be. And this is for young people, and this is for old people. It doesn't matter what your age is, those messages can hold us back. You can put whatever your fear is in this rectangle, and you see it one way today. But I want to challenge and encourage you to begin to see your fear in a different way. That's where the mentor comes in. Your fear may have such a hold on you that you can only see it one way. Sharing it with someone else allows them to help you to see it in a different way, because they're going to say, have you thought about this, or have you thought about this? That's what my counselor did for me. Here was the epiphany moment for me in this journey, was the recognition that this irrational fear is selfish. My counselor helped me to see and understand that my ability to speak and communicate and tell stories is one of the gifts that God has given me. I believe that all of us have been given gifts, and these gifts are not for us, but they're for the people that we encounter in our lives each and every single day. 1 Peter 4:10, and there's many verses that talk about our gifts. Each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. Again, the gifts are not given for us, but for the people that we encounter. She helped me begin to see that my ability to communicate and tell stories in a way that can make a difference in people's lives is one of the gifts that God has given me. And if I don't do it because I'm afraid that I'm not good enough, or I'm afraid that I don't have anything to say, or I'm afraid that my message isn't special, that's selfish on my part. None of us want to be selfish. What are the gifts that you've been given that you often have passed off as no big deal, anybody could do this? That's what I did with my speaking. What are the gifts that you've been given that you're passing off as no big deal, and that you're holding back and not utilizing that gift that God has given you. Here's a dramatic example of this. You all, I'm sure, remember the Jerry Sandusky Penn State child molestation case that all came to a head in 2011. Well, in the year 2000, there were 2 custodians, each of them in separate incidents on the same day at Penn State University in an athletic locker room, witnessed Jerry Sandusky molesting a young boy. Each of them separate incidents molesting a different young boy. They went to their supervisor and they shared with the supervisor what they saw. The 3 of them decided going against Joe Paterno, Penn State, and Jerry Sandusky and Penn State football is like going against the President of the United States. They said, we'll lose our jobs. This is a direct quote from the free report. They'll get rid of us all. They were afraid if they said anything, they would lose their jobs. Perhaps they would have lost their jobs. At the very beginning, I talk about the price that I paid for yelling at Billy. I got punched in the stomach because I had the courage to yell at Billy. These guys chose to live in fear and chose to say nothing. And I can't imagine the price that they are paying for what they did. But the even bigger price is the price that was paid by the young boys from 2000 to 2011 as Jerry Sandusky was continually allowed to molest young boys for 11 more years because those 3 chose to live in fear. Could they have lost their jobs? Could it have been swept under the rug? Sure, all of that could have happened. But I believe that they would sleep better. I believe that maybe somebody else would have begun to speak up, and it might have changed the whole thing. But recognize that when we stay in our fear, other people pay a price. So you have to ask yourself, who pays the price for your fear? As I was preparing for this today, and I pray every time before I speak, I always speak and I think about the one person that is with us today that needs to hear what I've got to share. And if I didn't do this because I was afraid, and trust me, I still get afraid of sharing this message, who would have paid a price if I had told Bob, no, I can't, I'm not going to do it that day. I can't do it. Somebody would have paid a price. Who is paying a price for your fear? That is a really hard question to ask, but it's a really powerful question to ask. And we have to recognize, again, that our gifts and talents are not for us, but they're for the people that we encounter each and every single day. You have to take you out of your boulder, whatever it is. You have to remove you from the equation. And when you take you out of it, here's what happens. That's pretty clever, isn't it? You thought I was saying Y-O-U, which I really was. But isn't it fascinating that when we are faced with a boulder, that when we take the you out of the word boulder, we get bolder. Courage is like a muscle. The more that we use it, the easier it gets. I'm never going to say it gets easy, but it does get easier. So we have to begin to courageously step into that fear. So our action steps, write down your messages. Again, become so familiar with them that you know what they are. Write down your old C and your new C. And then write down who is paying a price for your fear and what that looks like. The third step, we've named our fear, we've framed our fear, now we're going to claim our courage. John 10:10 says, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. One of my favorite verses in the Bible. These are the two sides of the fence. Satan is the thief. He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But when he comes, he doesn't come and say, hey, I am here today to mess up your life. I am here today, my horns are blaring, and I am going to make your life miserable. No, he comes in and he plants a little thought in your mind. Don't have that conversation with your wife today or your husband today. Don't have that conversation. You know, they're going to react. That's how Satan works. He steals, kills, and destroys. Which half of this equation do you want to be? So now it's time to courageously step in. You know, I did a lot of research on these boulders, and there is not a piece of equipment that can come and pick up that boulder and drop it off to the other side for somebody else to worry about. They take jackhammers and pickaxes and pieces of dynamite, and they blow up this boulder into little tiny pieces that they can carry away. And that's what I had to do with my counselor. As I faced that fear, I used to go and push and push and push against that boulder, and it wouldn't move. It wasn't until I went through that counseling that I began to break it down and begin to do things differently. One of the ways that I learned to do, one of the ways that I began to break down was I learned the lesson of the crack. You'll notice there's a stalk of corn growing out of cement. That's not something that should ever happen. But somehow a seed of corn found a place, found a crack to grow down and germinate and begin to grow in a place where it shouldn't grow. A seed of corn suffered, it persevered, it had character, and it got hope when it found that crack. And for me, the crack in my journey was discovering the word maybe. I used to say to myself, as much as I want to, I could never make my living as a speaker and a coach and a trainer. And I had some good, trusted friends said to me, David, put the word maybe in front of that. Maybe you could never make your living as a speaker and a coach and a trainer. But now all of a sudden, there's a crack of hope. Maybe I couldn't, but maybe I could. And oftentimes, all we need is that little bit of hope. And for me, that word maybe. What is the definitive saying that you have that you say all the time? I could never do this. I won't ever be able to. Put the word maybe in front of that and begin to find some hope. So we begin to chip away at the boulder. Recognize the fear will always be there. This is not a presentation about becoming fearless. This is about becoming courageous. If you Google fearless living, you'll find 52 million hits, I think it is, of things that you can look for. I believe that it is far better to lead a courageous life than a fearless life. Because if you choose fearless, you're always going to find a reason not to move forward. Do something scary every week. What do you do to take you out of your comfort zone? What do you do to practice being uncomfortable? Don't discount your own abilities. I believe that every one of us that is on this call is capable of far more than we give ourselves credit for. This is a picture from my sophomore year in high school. I was brought up to the varsity as a sophomore. I played the junior varsity games, but I also, my coach saw me as a 6'3" sophomore and thought that I was a guy that might be able to grow and might be able to develop into a better player. So the guy that you see on the right-hand side of that picture, his name was Steve. Steve was a junior. So in those varsity games, Steve was the next to the last guy to get in the game if we were way ahead. I was the last guy to get in the game. Steve was a really fun guy. He said, Dave, here's what we're going to do this year. We're going to give popcorn and we're going to give money to the manager. And in those games where we're not going to play, he's going to put popcorn and pop underneath our seats. And that's what he did. And so in those games that we didn't play, we were like fans because that's really what we were. We weren't going to play, so why not enjoy the game like fans? And our coach would never see because he was so busy with the game. Last part of the season, we're playing Chaska High School, who we are tied with for the conference lead, and there's 5 minutes to go in the game. Steve elbows me as I put my handful of popcorn in my mouth. He elbows me and points down to the head coach. I look down at him, and he's waving to me. And the score is tied. There's 5 minutes to go. And as I'm walking down to him, I'm thinking, do we need towels? Do we need water? Why is he waving me down? And I get to him and he says, get in the game for Davis. I don't play in these games. What is he doing? In those last 5 minutes, I scored 5 points, had 4 rebounds, and I blocked a shot. I wish I could tell you that we won the game. We didn't. But you see, my coach, who had been watching me practice in November and December and January and February, had watched me grow as a player, and he knew that I was capable of more than I would ever have thought that I was capable of. He put me into that situation that I didn't think I could handle, and I did. What is it that you are capable of that you don't give yourself credit for? When my coach called me down there, he didn't say, Dave, I think this would be a good time for you to go in the game. What do you think? No, he said, get in the game. So maybe that's, for some of you, maybe that's all you need to hear today. You've been spending your time in the stands watching everybody else. Maybe it's time to get in the game, in your business, in your church, in your relationships. Maybe it's time for you to get in the game. Fear calls us to be spectators. Courage calls us to get in the game. All glory to God, who is able through his mighty power at work within us, is able to accomplish infinitely more than we can ask or imagine if we are willing to courageously step into our fear, knowing that the God of Joshua has his arm around us just as he had his arm around Joshua. So here's your final action steps. Create your list to eliminate negative thoughts. Have a plan when they show up in your mind. Find the crack in your boulder, that word maybe. Do something scary. And we close with this last story, and it's from the movie Night and Day, K-N-I-G-H-T, the Night and Day, starring Tom Cruise and Cameron Diaz. They meet in an airplane sitting across the aisle from each other. They start their conversation with the basic generalities. What's your name? Where are you from? Where are you going? What do you do? Their conversation then goes to another level when they talk about what they hope to do someday. Cameron Diaz says, someday I hope to write a book. Tom Cruise says, someday I hope to go scuba diving in the Great Barrier Reef. Cameron Diaz says, someday I hope to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Tom Cruise brings the whole conversation to an abrupt halt when he says, someday is code for never. Wow. So as we close today, I want to challenge you with 4 things. I want to challenge you to name your fear. I want to challenge you to frame your fear. And I want to challenge you to claim your courage. And I want to challenge you to make today, this day, your someday to claim your courage. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I would love to connect with you. This is where you can find me. And I know that Bob will send this information out later. But I also have a book on Amazon that you're welcome to check out. And just again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you.